Chapter 6, Breaking the Ice. Monday arrived with the typical rush of meetings and deadlines, yet there was an undercurrent of something new in the air, something that Grace couldn't quite put her finger on but that made her pulse quicken every time she thought about Simon. The memory of their lunch together still lingered in her mind, and she couldn't help but wonder what his next move might be. The day passed in a blur of activity, and Grace found herself checking the clock more often than usual, anticipating the next time she might see Simon. Her professional side reminded her to keep things focused, but the other part of her, the part that had enjoyed their time together so much, was eager to explore whatever this was between them. It was late in the afternoon when Simon finally appeared in her office doorway, a confident smile playing on his lips. Grace looked up from her computer, her heart giving a little leap at the sight of him. "Busy day?" Simon asked, his tone casual as he leaned against the doorframe. Grace nodded, trying to keep her voice steady. "Always. But I'm managing." "I'm sure you are," Simon replied, his eyes twinkling with something like admiration. "I was hoping you might have some time to go over the new proposal with me. I think we're close, but I'd like your input before we finalize it." Grace appreciated the way Simon always sought her opinion. It wasn't just a matter of protocol, he genuinely valued what she had to say, and it made her feel respected in a way she hadn't expected. "Of course," she said, gesturing to the chair in front of her desk. "Let's take a look." Simon crossed the room and took a seat, sliding a folder across the desk to her. As Grace opened it and began reviewing the contents, Simon leaned back in his chair, watching her with a quiet intensity. She could feel his gaze on her, and it was both distracting and thrilling. She focused on the document, but her mind was partially on Simon, on the way he seemed to make even the most mundane workday tasks feel charged with something more. "This looks good," Grace said after a few minutes of silence, breaking the tension in the room. "I think the adjustments you've made will really resonate with the client. Just a few minor tweaks, and I think we'll be ready to go." Simon leaned forward, a satisfied smile on his lips. "I'm glad to hear that. I knew I could count on you to help fine-tune it." Grace felt a warm flush creep up her neck at his praise. "Just doing my job," she replied, trying to sound modest but unable to hide the pleasure in her voice. Simon studied her for a moment, as if weighing his next words. Then, with a casual air that belied the tension in the room, he asked, "How about a walk? It's a nice evening, and I could use a break from the office." "You?" Grace was caught off guard by the invitation, but she found herself nodding before she even had time to think about it. "A walk sounds nice." They left the office together, the air between them charged with the promise of something more. As they stepped outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden glow over the city. The streets were still busy, but the noise seemed to fade into the background as they walked side by side. Grace wasn't sure where they were headed, but she didn't care. The simple act of walking with Simon, of being close to him without the pressures of work, felt like a small luxury. She found herself relaxing, the tension of the day melting away as they strolled through the city streets. After a few blocks, Simon led them to a small park, the kind of place that was easy to miss if you didn't know it was there. It was quiet and peaceful, with a few people sitting on benches or walking their dogs. They made their way to a secluded spot near a fountain, where they could sit and talk without interruption. Grace sat down on the edge of the fountain, and Simon took a seat beside her, their shoulders almost touching. For a moment, they simply sat in comfortable silence, watching the water trickle from the fountain and listening to the distant hum of the city. Simon broke the silence first, his voice low and thoughtful. "You know, Grace, I've been thinking a lot about our conversation the other night. About what you said, how you've built this life for yourself, how you've raised your daughters on your own. It's incredible, really. Not many people could do what you've done." Grace felt a swell of emotion at his words, the sincerity in his tone catching her off guard. She looked down at her hands, unsure of how to respond. "I just did what I had to do," she said softly. "There wasn't really a choice." Simon shook his head slightly, his gaze never leaving her face. "There's always a choice, Grace. You could have given up, taken an easier path. But you didn't. You chose to keep going, to succeed despite the odds. That says a lot about who you are. Grace swallowed hard, the words hitting her deeper than she expected. She wasn't used to this kind of praise, especially from someone like Simon, someone who seemed to see right through her tough exterior to the person beneath. I guess I don't think about it that way, Grace admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I've just always been focused on what's next, on making sure I don't fall behind. Simon nodded, his expression understanding. I get that. But you deserve to give yourself credit for everything you've accomplished. It's not just about keeping up, it's about thriving. There was a pause, and in that moment, Grace felt something shift between them, an unspoken connection that was growing stronger with each passing second. She looked up at Simon, meeting his gaze, and for the first time, she allowed herself to truly see him, not just as a colleague, but as someone who had become unexpectedly important to her. Thank you, Grace said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. I don't hear that often. Simon reached out, his hand gently covering hers. The touch was warm, comforting, and yet it sent a shiver down her spine. You deserve to hear it, Grace. And I'll keep telling you as long as you need to hear it. Grace looked down at their hands, the simple contact feeling more intimate than she could have imagined. She wanted to pull away, to retreat back into the safety of her professional persona, but she couldn't. Instead, she found herself leaning into the moment, allowing herself to feel something she hadn't felt in years, hope. Simon, she began, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. Simon's thumb brushed gently over the back of her hand, his touch both tender and reassuring. You don't have to say anything, Grace. Just, let this be what it is. Grace felt a tear slip down her cheek, surprising her. She quickly wiped it away, embarrassed, but Simon's hand moved to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away the remnants of the tear. You don't always have to be strong, Simon said softly. It's okay to let someone else in. Grace closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. The world seemed to fade away, leaving just the two of them in this quiet moment, where everything else felt distant and unimportant. When she opened her eyes, Simon was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen before, something raw and vulnerable, something that mirrored the emotions swirling inside her. In that moment, Grace knew that whatever this was between them, it was real. It was something that had been building from the moment they met, something that neither of them had expected but couldn't ignore. Slowly, Simon leaned in, and Grace felt her breath catch in her throat. The world around them seemed to disappear, the only sound the soft trickle of the fountain and the pounding of her heart in her ears. When Simon's lips finally met hers, it was like the world tilted on its axis. The kiss was gentle, tentative, as if they were both afraid to break the spell that had been cast over them. But as the seconds passed, it deepened, the connection between them growing stronger with each passing moment. Grace felt herself melt into the kiss, her hand sliding up to rest on Simon's chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her fingertips. It was a kiss that spoke of all the things they hadn't said, all the feelings they had kept hidden, and it left her breathless. When they finally pulled away, their foreheads resting together, Grace felt like she was standing on the edge of something new and terrifying, but also incredibly exciting. Simon's voice was barely a whisper as he spoke, his breath warm against her skin. I don't know where this will lead, Grace, but I want to find out, together. Grace opened her eyes, meeting his gaze with a mixture of fear and hope. So do I, she whispered back. And in that moment, Grace knew that she was ready to take the leap, ready to explore whatever this was between them, no matter where it might lead. Click follow for the next chapters.